You can't be pro-Putin and pro-Ukraine. You have to decide between the two, and reform is pro-Putin. And
immediately. Just yesterday, Prime Minister, I was with a Ukrainian delegation, Prime Minister, amongst all of the noise, to utilise that leverage, because that, I think, is one of the most powerful negotiating points that the West has against the vile dictator Putin.
You know what's more entertaining than watching politicians argue over who's tougher on Russia? Watching them do it in the House of Commons, where they have to be polite about it while absolutely seething underneath. Welcome to this week's episode of Westminster Squared Up, where Keir Starmer decided to go after Reform UK over their former Wales leader getting banged up for taking Russian bribes, and Richard Tice came back swinging with tales of personally driving pickup trucks to Ukraine. It's got everything: accusations of Kremlin connections, furious heckling, and the kind of political theater that makes Prime Minister's questions look like a vicar's tea party. This is UK Political Insight. Please don't forget to hit the subscribe button for more updates on this channel. Thank you. Today we're breaking down the fiery Commons clash that had everyone talking. Let's dive in. Right, so let's set the scene. Last week, Nathan Gill, who was Reform UK's former leader in Wales, got sentenced to 10.5 years in prison. What for? Oh, just the small matter of taking 40,000 quid in bribes from the Kremlin to make pro-Russian statements in the European Parliament. Not a great look, is it? When your party's former regional leader is literally being paid by Putin's regime to spread propaganda, that's the kind of scandal that tends to follow you around like a bad smell. And Keir Starmer, sensing blood in the water, decided to absolutely hammer reform over it during a Commons session. The Prime Minister stood up and said, "It's shocking that a senior official, the leader in Wales, has been jailed for over 10 years for pro-Russia bribes." He called it extraordinary and demanded that Reform's leadership have the courage to launch an investigation into how on earth this happened in their party and what other links there might be. That's not just a political attack, that's Starmer basically standing up in Parliament and asking Reform to publicly prove they're not compromised by Russian influence. It's brutal, it's direct, and it put Reform on the back foot immediately. Starmer went on to say that if Reform had nothing to hide, they should be happy to investigate, which is classic political framing, right? By refusing to investigate, you look guilty. By agreeing to investigate, you're admitting there might be a problem. It's a proper catch-22. And Keir knew exactly what he was doing. He was painting Reform as a party that's soft on Russia, potentially compromised by foreign influence, and unwilling to clean house. For a party that positions itself as patriotic defenders of Britain, that's about as damaging as it gets. Now, Richard Tice, Reform's deputy leader, was not having any of it. While Starmer was speaking, Tice was heckling from the benches, calling it nonsense and absolute twaddle, which fair play is quite restrained by Westminster standards. You can tell he was absolutely fuming, though. Having your party accused of being pro-Putin on the floor of the House of Commons isn't something you just shrug off. So when Tice got his chance to respond, he came out swimming with a very specific rebuttal. He reminded the House that last year he personally donated a 5-figure sum, bought a pickup truck, filled it with first aid supplies, and drove it with other friends and colleagues to Ukraine, where he donated it to the brave soldiers fighting against Russian aggression. He emphasized that his support and Reform support for Ukraine has been rock solid throughout. And you know what? That's actually a pretty compelling defense. It's hard to accuse someone of being pro-Putin when they've literally driven medical supplies to the front lines. That's not virtue signaling, that's actual tangible support. Tice went on to urge the government to leverage the power European nations have to put pressure on what he called vile dictator Vladimir Putin. So he's trying to flip the script here, positioning Reform as being tough on Russia and suggesting that the government should be doing more. It's a solid political move, taking the attack and turning it back on the accuser, but here's the problem. It doesn't actually address Starmer's central point, which is that Reform had a senior official who was literally on the Kremlin's payroll. You can donate all the pickup trucks you want, but if one of your former leaders was taking Russian bribes, that's a massive problem. And Starmer wasn't about to let it go either. He fired back, saying that Tice could have stood up and said Reform has seen sense and decided they will have an investigation into what happened in the bribery case. He acknowledged Tice's personal support for Ukraine, but said the simple fact is you can't be pro-Putin and pro-Ukraine. You have to decide between the two, and Reform is pro-Putin. That's an absolutely devastating line. He's not accusing Tice personally of being compromised, but he's saying the party as a whole has a Putin problem. And then he hammered it home. They've just been convicted, a 10-year sentence for taking pro-Russian bribes. It couldn't be clearer than that, and an unwillingness to say we need to investigate how on earth that happened. Can he not see the inconsistency? That's the key question, isn't it? If Nathan Gill was taking Russian money and making pro-Kremlin statements, how did that happen? Who knew about it? Are there other people in Reform who've been compromised? These are legitimate questions, and Starmer's right to ask them. But from Reform's perspective, launching an internal investigation is basically admitting guilt and inviting weeks or months of damaging headlines. It's a political nightmare either way. And then, just when you thought it couldn't get any more brutal, Kemi Badenoch piled on. The conservative leader stood up and said it's a disgrace that Reform are still blaming NATO for Russia's aggression. She added that it shouldn't come as a surprise when their former leader in Wales was sent to prison last week for taking bribes from Putin. So now Reform's getting it from both sides. Labour and the Conservatives, normally at each other's throats, are united in hammering Reform over Russia. That tells you how politically toxic this issue is. Let's talk about the NATO comment, because that's important context. Reform UK, and particularly Nigel Farage, have previously suggested that NATO expansion provoked Russia into invading Ukraine. That's a take that gets a lot of pushback because it sounds like making excuses for Putin. Whether you think NATO expansion was wise or not, the fact remains that Russia chose to invade a sovereign country. Nobody forced them to do it. But Reform's more nuanced, or, depending on your perspective, more sympathetic view of Russia's motivations has left them vulnerable to accusations of being soft on Putin. And when one of your former officials gets convicted of literally taking Kremlin bribes, that vulnerability becomes a gaping wound. Now, here's the thing, though. The situation's complicated. Richard Tice clearly does support Ukraine. His pickup truck story isn't made up. It's a matter of public record. He genuinely did drive supplies to the front lines. But that doesn't mean Reform as a party doesn't have a Russia problem. Both things can be true at the same time. Tice can be personally opposed to Putin, while his party has harbored people with dodgy Russian connections and promoted narratives that align with Kremlin talking points. The question Starmer's asking is a fair one. How did Nathan Gill end up as Reform's leader in Wales while secretly taking Russian money? Did anyone in the party know? Were there warning signs that got ignored? And most importantly, is he the only one? Because if there are other people in Reform who've been compromised by Russian influence, that's a massive national security issue. And refusing to investigate sends the message that Reform either doesn't take it seriously or has something to hide. From a political strategy perspective, Starmer's playing this brilliantly. He knows Reform is eating into Labour's vote in certain areas, particularly among working-class voters who feel abandoned by both major parties. By painting Reform as pro-Putin and potentially compromised by Russian money, he's trying to make them toxic to patriotic British voters. It's the same playbook that worked against Jeremy Corbyn, who got hammered for being soft on Russia after the Salisbury poisonings. The difference is Corbyn was leader of the opposition at the time. Reform is a smaller insurgent party, but they're growing fast, and Starmer clearly sees them as a threat worth neutralizing. For Reform, this is a genuine crisis. They've built their brand on being the party that tells it like it is, that stands up for Britain, that isn't captured by special interests. But having a former leader go to prison for taking foreign bribes completely undermines that narrative. It makes them look amateur at best and compromised at worst. And in the current geopolitical climate where Russia is actively at war with Ukraine and engaged in hybrid warfare against the West, being seen as soft on Putin is political death. Richard Tice's defense, while genuine, doesn't actually solve the problem. Yes, he drove supplies to Ukraine. Yes, he's personally opposed to Putin. But that's him as an individual. What about the party? What about the systems and processes that allowed someone like Nathan Gill to rise to a leadership position while secretly working for a hostile foreign power? Those are the questions that need answers, and so far, Reform hasn't provided them.